Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Every December arrives the same way in my family, with the cheerful mailers that look like they were designed by a suburban marketing team armed with cinnamon, matching sweaters, and a ruthless sense of editing. Because the photo that lands in everyone's mailbox shows a complete tableau of my parents, my brother, his wife, their two blonde boys with gap-toothed grins, and my sister with her perfect blowout and that laugh she reserves for cameras, while the place where I would stand is not only empty but airbrushed into a decorative wreath, and I stare at it each year like a magic trick that keeps sawing me in half without the courtesy of applause, knowing that somehow I've been reduced to a rumor in my own bloodline. I used to tell myself it was an oversight born of distance or schedules, the way flights get delayed and pies get burned, but then came the year when no one even sent a text asking if I'd be home, and I learned about the gathering the way strangers do, through a Facebook post that cropped tighter than a haircut, captioned with the words, "Our perfect family," and a line of digital snowflakes that made my teeth ache. I sat there with my laptop in a kitchen that still smelled like burnt coffee and old ambition, and I felt something unspool from my ribs, not quite grief and not quite rage, more like a cold clarity that whispered, "If you are going to be erased, at least supervise the editing." The truth, if anyone ever asked for it, is that I am not difficult. I am simply inconvenient to a narrative that prefers daughters who stay local, agree with holiday politics, and choose lives that can be introduced in a single calm sentence at church, while mine takes a paragraph and a few follow-up questions, none of which my mother enjoys answering. She calls what I do projects in a tone you might use for rashes, and when I told her that my company made a list that plays as loudly in business as the national anthem plays in stadiums, she said she was proud and asked if I had a coat warm enough for winter, as if success could be caught by a draft. The last time I flew back for Thanksgiving, I drove from the airport in a rental sedan that smelled like someone else's gum and walked into the dining room with a pie and a smile so ready it felt rehearsed, only to hear my father say he didn't think I'd actually come, which is why there was no place set, and I found myself eating mashed potatoes from a dessert plate in a corner, like a visiting contractor whose invoice was overdue. On the morning this year's photo dropped, I recognized the backyard by the cedar fence my brother still hasn't stained, and I recognized the way my mother angled her chin to hide the line she pretends she doesn't see. And I recognized the expression on my own face reflected in the black screen before the video played, an expression that said I was done pretending erasure was an accident you could apologize for with a leftover cookie. I can tell you that the first sensation wasn't fury but fatigue, the bone-deep kind you feel after packing boxes alone, followed by an absurd laugh that shook out of me like a sneeze, because the caption, "So blessed to be together," might as well have said, "Wish you weren't here," and I suddenly thought, fine, let me honor that. I poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink, and I opened a folder of headshots from the last time a photographer bullied me into standing in front of a gray backdrop. And while the kettle hissed, I did what any daughter with a Wi-Fi connection and a sense of theater would do, which was to make a version of their picture that included me in the most unapologetic way possible, not by sneaking into the edge or hovering like a ghost, but by placing my smiling face square in the center where the wreath had been, crisp and bright and maybe too pleased, with a caption of my own that read, "Found the missing ornament," because if I was going to be an object in their holiday narrative, I might as well be the shiny one. I didn't post it first, not yet, because revenge that satisfies needs the right audience, and I knew the audience wasn't strangers. It was the family group thread that goes suspiciously silent whenever I speak. The one that lights up for weather warnings and casserole recipes, so I attached my edit there with a little note, "Fixed your layout. Happy to help with creative direction next year." The read receipts bloomed like tiny betrayals, one by one, and then the messages came in a familiar order that felt like choreography I never auditioned for. My sister starting with, "Oh come on, that's not fair," and a lecture about tone. My brother chiming in with defensive humor that made him sound like a morning radio host. My mother sending a paragraph about kindness in the season and how fragile grandma gets when there is conflict, and my father withholding judgment like a referee in the fourth quarter who doesn't want to blow the whistle, yet somehow implying the foul was mine. I kept my replies polite because there is nothing more upsetting to a passive-aggressive chorus than a soloist who stays calm, and I told them I loved them and that I would appreciate being invited before I was judged for not attending. Which is a sentence that would look nice cross-stitched over the hearth if anyone had the patience. My small act didn't heal anything, but it didn't scratch either. It stung just enough to prove nerve endings were alive, and yes, I slept better that night than I had in months, not because I won but because I stopped pretending I didn't care. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from an unknown number in my hometown, a neighbor who somehow found my contact through a chain of women who remember everything, and she said she had seen the family photo online, and she had seen my edit. And she wished she had had my nerve years ago when her in-laws played the same game with her name at the holiday table, and she wondered if I could give her the number of a good photographer in case she ever decided to make her own card that didn't ask permission. I played that message twice and felt an idea rise, not a spark exactly, more like a pilot light I hadn't checked in a while, and I thought about how distance can be a weapon or a stage depending on how you use it, and I pictured a street I knew better than my own palm. The one where Grandma still walks to the mailbox in her robe, where the bus lurches and the kids cut across the corner lawn, where no one misses anything that changes overnight, and my pulse started to tick in a rhythm. That sounded like a plan, because if my family wanted a public story without me, I could write one they would have to read, even with their eyes squeezed shut. I wish I could say the family thread softened after my little layout correction, that someone picked up the phone and offered a seat rather than a scolding, but what rolled in over the next week felt like a weather pattern I had learned to forecast in my bones. A high-pressure system of polite dismissal layered over a cold front of backhanded concern, with my sister forwarding an article about choosing peace during the holidays, like I was a middle schooler who had thrown a stapler, my brother suggesting we all take a breath while posting photos of his new smoker and a roast that looked like it had been blessed by 3 television chefs, and my mother sending a soft message about how Grandma gets tired by noise, which translated roughly to "you're the noise," leaving me to sip lukewarm coffee and read every line twice to be sure I wasn't hallucinating the subtext. I tried the reasonable path because I keep a tiny, stubborn faith that reason can mend what performance ruins, so I called my father at lunchtime when I knew he would be alone in his truck, and I told him, carefully and without theatrics, that I missed the years when I could wander into the kitchen and steal the first roll from the basket, that I wanted a plan where inclusion didn't require an RSVP carved into stone weeks in advance, and he listened with those considerate little hums men use when they are driving, then said he hated drama and would circle back after he talked to Mom, which in our family usually means the next time the planets align over a frozen lake. When the circle never came back around, I let myself remember the times I had tried to wedge my way into their favorite narrative with gifts that were almost jokes and almost pleas, like the year I mailed a stack of restaurant gift cards labeled, "For your favorite child and her entourage," and waited for the laugh that would acknowledge we all understood the joke, only to receive a thank you text from my sister-in-law that mentioned the boys loved the chicken nuggets, full stop, and I realized the joke had become a receipt. I remembered the Thanksgiving when I stood at the sink washing the good dishes because I thought service might translate into belonging, and my mother told me to leave it because I always splash, then shooed me toward the living room where no one was watching the game. And the memory felt so absurd I laughed out loud alone, which is how you know a wound has started to thicken into scar. It would have been simple to block them and move on, to let my success continue. In another city with people who sent actual invitations and meant the words, "come by," but simple has never been how I metabolize humiliation, and I could feel a particular kind of energy gathering, not the hot, messy kind that burns bridges for sport, but the cooler, surgical kind that rearranges a room with the furniture already there. So I decided to make something that looked like a family gesture but functioned as a mirror tilted at just the right angle, and I spent a Saturday building it with the same care my mother gives to her cookie platters, comparing paper stocks and testing the weight of envelopes, then laying out a holiday card that was so tasteful it hurt, a cream background with a border of pine that would pass inspection at any church mailbox, and in the center a single photo of me laughing with my head thrown back a little. The kind of candid you only get when someone on set makes a wicked joke, except I did not include a wicked line, only a caption that read, "Wishing you a season of full tables and fuller welcome," followed by my name and a line that said, "Gratitude for this year's mention in Forbes' list," which was true and apparently unshareable in our family unless it arrived as a humble footnote beneath a casserole recipe. I ordered a few dozen prints, addressed them to the extended relatives, who never quite know what to believe, to old neighbors who still tell stories on porches, and, with a tiny tremor in my hand that I refused to judge, to my parents' closest friends, and to the ladies from Grandma's Wednesday circle who have opinions like oak trees. And then I mailed them all at once from a post office 2 blocks from my apartment, where the clerk with the chipped blue nail polish wished me a good day without knowing she was blessing a minor earthquake. The feedback loop arrived faster than I expected, a chorus of private messages from cousins I hadn't seen since graduation, saying they were proud of me and that they had always wondered why I vanished from the photos like a witness in a crime drama. And then a more delicate batch from older relatives who wrote in full paragraphs about how families sometimes fall into grooves they mistake for traditions, and how those grooves become trenches if no one climbs out, and how they were glad to see me standing, and if that was not holiday theology, I don't know what is. My mother's reaction fell in 2 waves. The first, a restrained note about how postcards can be misinterpreted, which made me grin because misinterpretation requires interpretation, which means attention, which means we were finally looking at the same wall. And the second, a call that I let go to voicemail, where she sounded tired and said she wished I had talked to her first, which I had, and then wished I would stop airing grievances in public, which I had not, unless the U.S. Postal Service now counts as social media. I won't pretend that small revenge cured the ache, but it did something important to the ache's posture, because now I was not the girl waiting outside the fence with a plate of store-bought cookies and a hope no one knows how to handle. I was the woman who understood how stories travel, how rooms turn, and how a sentence placed in the right mailbox can tilt a family conversation without a single raised voice, and that understanding spread through me like a steadying hand on a railing. I roasted a chicken for myself and poured a glass of red and wrote Grandma a real letter on good paper, telling her about the neighborhoods I run through in the morning and the sound the bakery makes when the oven's open. And I ended with a question about the rosebush she planted the year I was born, because revenge without tenderness rots into something brittle, and I refuse to become brittle just because they prefer me silent. 2 days later, while I was answering emails and ignoring a thread about a cousin's gender reveal that had somehow become a public diplomacy exercise, my phone lit with an unknown area code from a town not far from where Grandma lives. And the man on the line introduced himself as a regional manager for an outdoor advertising company who said, in the brisk way of people who sell space the sky already owns, that he had received my inquiry through a contact form I did not remember filling but must have opened after that neighbor's voicemail, and that he had a cancellation on a prime unit along Maple Ridge, 3 blocks from a street my feet could navigate with my eyes closed. And did I want to hold it through Monday, because if I didn't, a car dealership would. And in the pause where sensible people request time to think, I heard my mother's voicemail about not going public tap the side of my skull like a spoon against glass, and I said I would place a temporary hold today, wire the deposit this afternoon, and send over creative by end of week, which is how you commit to a decision you can no longer pretend is a joke, and how you find yourself pacing your kitchen with the oven off, replaying your grandmother's slow walk to the mailbox, and promising that if I was going to step into the sky, I would do it with a message so clean it could not be dismissed as a tantrum, even if everyone who drove past felt the slap. When the manager from the Billboard company emailed me the formal confirmation and the price sheet, I stared at the numbers like they were coordinates to a map I had no business unfolding, because it wasn't just an advertisement. It was an act of punctuation in a family sentence that had never let me finish my side, and I knew that once the ink dried and the check cleared there would be no pretending I had sent it in jest. Yet, something inside me, the part that had been rehearsing apologies for 30 years, also began to hum with a different rhythm, one that felt steadier and more deliberate than the chaotic swells of anger I used to swallow. And I realized I was not about to scream into a void. I was about to carve my name on the skyline in letters no one could skim past. That realization pushed me forward, but before the giant reveal, before the unveiling on Maple Ridge where Grandma's curtains still flutter in the winter drafts, I tested myself with smaller maneuvers, little pricks of rebellion that might seem petty on paper but felt like necessary warm-ups for the muscle of vengeance I was building, and those early gestures had a comedy to them that kept me sane while I prepared the main act. The first was on social media, where my family lives like unpaid actors in a soap opera that no one outside our county follows, and I started leaving comments that looked innocent but dripped with enough sarcasm to stain. Under one of my brother's pictures of the kids decorating a tree without me in the background, I wrote, "Looks so warm and together, almost like there was room for one more, but what do I know?" And though he responded with a laughing emoji, my sister privately messaged me that I needed to stop making everything about myself. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my wine, because it had never been about me in their world. That was the entire point, and now the smallest mention of my absence was enough to make them twitch. I leaned into it further by sending my dad a birthday card with a crisp 100 tucked inside and a note that said, "For the favorite child, I assume that's still not me, but maybe this will buy me half a place at the table," and when he called to say thank you, his voice carried that brittle mix of discomfort and forced cheer that told me he got the message but would never say it aloud. It was delicious, in a way, watching them squirm at doses of honesty so diluted they could hardly choke on it, because if they could not acknowledge the wound, I would dress it with humor sharp enough to cut. Then came the evening I was in town for a business trip, staying in a hotel less than 15 minutes from the house where they had gathered for my nephew's birthday, a fact I knew because my sister broadcasted it live on Instagram. Cake candles glowing like a crime scene in progress. I could have walked in, I could have knocked on the door and smiled through clenched teeth, but instead I posted my own story from a cafe down the street, tagging the city, tagging the bakery, tagging every landmark that announced I was closer than the neighbor's mailbox. And then I shut my phone off for 3 hours. When I powered it back on, there were missed calls and a single text from my mother that read, "If you were nearby, why didn't you stop in?" To which I replied, "Oh, I assumed my invitation got lost like every other one." She didn't respond, and that silence was the most satisfying proof that the truth, even when dressed like a joke, could still crack the porcelain facade. Yet none of these minor revenges, not the sarcastic comments or the pointed absence, could quench the deeper hunger that was growing in me, because they were tactical strikes, not a campaign, and what I craved was something so large, so impossible to ignore, that it would force them to face the imbalance they had been perfecting for decades. That craving sat with me as I paced my apartment in the evenings, imagining the look on my sister's face when her car rolled past an enormous version of my smile, or the way my mother might tug at her sweater collar when neighbors whispered over coffee about the billboard she had to see every morning on her way to the grocery store. The beauty of the idea was not just in the audacity, but in its permanence. Because unlike a snide remark or a clipped comment on Facebook, a billboard does not vanish when someone scrolls. It looms until the contract ends, towering over mailboxes and sidewalks, demanding acknowledgement. As the deadline approached for submitting the creative design, I found myself obsessing over every detail: the font size, the color of the background, the tilt of my shoulders in the photo, because I understood this was not merely about revenge. It was about authoring a chapter in the family chronicle that could not be edited out by omission. I imagined Grandma's slow walk to the corner mailbox, her cardigan pulled tight, her eyes lifting almost absent-mindedly to the sky where she would suddenly see me, larger than life, with words bold enough to slap but polished enough to claim dignity. Made Forbes 30 under 30. Did you? That sentence would not only sting my siblings, it would hang over their perfect little narrative like a storm cloud that refused to move. And yet, as the design firm polished my proof and the invoice hovered in my inbox, I felt the faint tremor of doubt, not because I worried it wouldn't work, but because I knew once it went up, there would be no undoing. No return to pretending I was the harmless relative who occasionally sulked. The moment the billboard rose, I would be a public adversary in their eyes, and I had to decide whether I was ready to stand as tall as the steel frame that would hold my face. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spin shadows across my walls, I thought back to every year of photos, every clipped remark, every silence that pressed heavier than insults, and I realized that the question was not whether I was ready to fight, but whether I was willing to stop being erased, and the answer came in the quiet certainty that if my family would not let me belong in their frame, then I would build one too large for them to crop. The contract was signed with the kind of trembling hand you get when you know you are stepping past the point of no return, and the wire transfer cleared faster than I expected, leaving me with nothing but the countdown clock in my head and the obligation to deliver artwork that would soon loom over the only neighborhood where my family's opinion still carried any weight. I spent nights staring at my laptop screen, cycling through drafts with fonts that seemed either too polite or too aggressive, testing backgrounds that looked festive, then scrapping them for tones that whispered power instead of holiday cheer. Because this was not a Christmas card, it was a declaration. I wanted the message to be sharp enough to sting, but polished enough that no one could accuse me of acting like a child throwing a tantrum. After all, I had been cast as the difficult one for so long that anything less than flawless execution would only feed their story, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. The image I finally chose was professional but radiant, the kind of headshot usually reserved for magazine profiles, and I tilted my chin just slightly, enough to suggest confidence without arrogance, then added the line in bold white text that burned like a torch, made Forbes 30 under 30. Did you? The sentence was not just a brag, it was a scalpel designed to cut through decades of silence, and when I leaned back to study it, I knew I had found the exact tone I had been chasing. The week before the installation, I could hardly sit still in my apartment, pacing between my kitchen and the couch, checking my email like a gambler waiting for a hand to be dealt. Because the thought of my grandmother's quiet street becoming the stage for my private rebellion filled me with a nervous electricity I had never known. I imagined the crews hauling the panels into place at dawn, the metal frame rattling as bolts locked into place, my face slowly climbing into the sky where it could no longer be cropped or dismissed. At night, I lay in bed thinking about the routes my family drove every weekend, the detours they would have to make if they wanted to avoid me, and the impossibility of denying that I existed once my smile was staring down at them like a verdict. Every little slight, every year of being excluded, every lukewarm acknowledgement of my achievements would be gathered into that one towering image, and the thought both thrilled and unsettled me, because I knew this was more than revenge, it was the burial of the old dynamic, and there would be no resurrection. The night before the reveal, I drove past Maple Ridge just to remind myself how ordinary the space looked, a quiet strip with weathered lampposts and cracked sidewalks, the kind of street where kids ride bikes in circles and neighbors lean over fences to trade gossip. The empty billboard frame stood there like a ribcage without lungs, waiting to breathe, and I parked for a moment with my headlights off, watching the silhouette against the winter sky. I thought about Grandma, who still shuffles down that road in slippers to fetch her mail, who sometimes waves at passing cars as if the world has not grown sharper around her, and I wondered if she would smile when she saw me up there or if she would sigh the way my mother would. Muttering about spectacles. For the first time in weeks, a twinge of doubt curled in my stomach, not about whether I wanted the billboard, but about what exactly I was demanding from it. Was it revenge, recognition, or something in between? Yet, even as the questions rose, I knew the panels were already printed, the crew already scheduled, and the path already sealed. When the morning came, I did not sleep, and instead I drove out before dawn, pulling into a side street where I could watch the installation unfold. A pickup truck rumbled up first, followed by a utility vehicle stacked with equipment, and 3 men in neon vests stepped out, carrying the kind of casual efficiency that comes from years of climbing ladders and bolting steel in the cold. They didn't know they were handling more than panels and bolts. They were handling 30 years of my erasure, 30 years of jokes at my expense, 30 years of waiting outside the frame. I watched as they slid the first panel into place, a sliver of my cheek, then the second, a sweep of my hair, and finally the last, the words blazing across the sky with a clarity that no family group chat could muffle. It was almost anticlimactic in its swiftness, the way something so monumental could be lifted into permanence in under an hour. But when the workers stepped back and the whole thing stood there, massive and immovable, I felt my pulse hammer in my ears, because there I was, larger than life, asking a question they could never answer without admitting what they had done. By mid-morning, my phone began to buzz with numbers I half recognized, neighbors who still remembered me as the girl riding her bike around the cul-de-sac, cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years, old classmates who now lived states away but had already seen the billboard in someone's photo. The texts were a mix of congratulations and disbelief, some calling it brilliant, others asking if I had finally lost my mind, but all of them acknowledging me, speaking my name, putting me back into circulation where my family had tried to erase me. I let the messages pile up without responding, savoring the silence like a fine drink, because I knew the only calls that mattered hadn't come yet. And then, as the sun shifted and the sky turned the color of old steel, my phone lit with the name I had been waiting for, Mom. I stared at the screen, the vibration rattling against the table like a dare, and I didn't answer, not yet, because some conversations deserve to sit in the air like smoke before you decide whether to breathe them in or let them drift away. When I finally slid my thumb across the screen and let my mother's voice pour through the speaker, the sound came wrapped in that brittle calm she uses before church arguments and after emergency room visits. A careful control that says she is about to perform reason while asking me to perform remorse, and she began with a question that was not a question at all. Did you really think humiliating the family in public would make you feel included? To which I answered, with a steadiness I did not know I had until that moment, that the humiliation had been public for years. We had simply staged it in living rooms and backyards instead of on a quiet stretch of Maple Ridge. And if a billboard felt loud, it was only because silence had been louder for so long that my ears needed a new frequency to hear anything true. She inhaled sharply and said Grandma was distressed, that neighbors were calling, that my brother had to explain to his boys why their aunt had attacked the family, and I listened without interrupting because there is a point at which interruption is surrender, and then I said I would speak to Grandma first. I would speak to the one person who still writes me letters on stationery and tapes recipes to the back with neat little squares of labeled tape. Because if I owed anyone an explanation, it was the woman who never edited me out of a single story she told at church. Grandma answered on the second ring with that raspy warmth cigarettes left behind decades ago, and she did not ask why I had done it, though I could hear the front screen door creak, as if she had stepped outside to talk where the walls would not listen. And she said the street looked different today in a way that made her feel both taller and older, that the postman had laughed and said he hadn't seen a thing this bold since a candidate put his own face up by the feed store, and then she said something that lodged under my ribs like a soft nail. You know, honey, I told your mother once that if she kept calling you difficult you would learn to be difficult in all the useful ways, and I think I might have been right. And before I could decide whether I wanted to laugh or cry, she told me she had already clipped the local weekly because it had posted a grainy photo under the header, "Ambitious Daughter Goes Big," which made me picture a circle of women in their kitchen chairs discussing whether big was good or bad, and the picture made me grin in spite of everything. She didn't entirely bless it, she didn't entirely condemn it. She just asked whether I had eaten breakfast and whether I could send her a real print of the headshot, because the newspaper quality made my teeth look like chalk. Which was so exactly the conversation I needed that I felt my shoulders drop against the seat back as if I had been holding a bag of cement without noticing. The rest of the day unspoled like a town parade in slow motion, with horns honking as cars slowed, with a teenage boy on a skateboard taking a selfie under my chin, with a pair of retirees walking tiny dogs and pointing upward with the delight of people who have been offered free theater, and I tried to stay away from the comment threads, but I failed because curiosity is a thirst. And there I saw everything grief can write when it wears the mask of moral outrage. Friends of my parents declaring that family should be kept sacred, cousins subtweeting about selfish women, old classmates quoting scripture out of context, and then a trickle of private notes from people like the neighbor who had called me weeks ago, saying they wished they had done something years earlier when their in-laws made the table feel like a courtroom, and that trickle became a stream which became a quiet flood, and in that flood I heard something rare and clean, not applause for the billboard but a collective exhale that sounded like women admitting the room had been too small for their names. When the first apology came, it arrived slantwise the way apologies often do in families that treat confession like a public utility you have to pay to use. My father calling to say it was a lot to take in, and that he never meant to make me feel left out. The passive construction doing all the heavy lifting while the subject of who made the choices hovered off stage, and I told him I believed he did not mean harm even when harm was done, which was both true and insufficient. Then I asked him something I knew he could answer without retreating into silence, whether he would meet me for coffee at the diner with the cracked red booths, and whether he would bring his calendar so we could set a real date for a real meal where I would arrive to a chair with my name on it. And after the long pause where he decided how much trouble permission costs, he said yes, which was not a repair, but it was a plank you could step on without falling through. My sister's message landed like a rock thrown from the shadow of a hedge. You made us look ridiculous, and I replied that I had only made us visible, and visibility can be ridiculous when a family has rehearsed invisibility for years, and she left that on red, which in our history counts as high diplomacy. The last move of my revenge was not the billboard itself, but the way I used the noise it made, because late that afternoon, while the sun was sliding behind the feed silo and painting my face with a copper glare that turned my eyes into something almost mythic, I posted a photo of the sign with a caption that did not gloat, that did not beg, that simply said, "Next year, there will be room," and under it I tagged the local food pantry with a note that for every family in town that brought in extra chair to their table this season, I would fund a week of groceries in their name, and within an hour the pantry director called me crying into the receiver, saying she did not care about family feuds, she cared about people eating, and could we set up a forum. And we did, and by evening there were more chairs promised than I had expected, and my mother, who reads everything even when she pretends she does not, texted me a photo of our dining room with the leaves extended and 6 chairs arranged instead of 5, a message without words that felt like a door left on the latch rather than bolted shut. I do not know if that door leads back to the same house or to a set rebuilt under new lighting. I do not know if the next holiday card will include me or if it will arrive with a stamp of forced cheer and a background so tightly framed you can barely see the fence. I do not know if my brother will teach his boys that pride is a sin or that pride can be a spine, and I do not know whether the billboard will be a family legend we laugh about someday or a monument they pretend never existed. What I know is that for one winter week, on a street where my grandmother's plants still fight the frost and the school bus turns with a squeal that sounds like childhood, my name could not be erased. My face could not be cropped, and the question I asked, "Did you?" hung over us all like whether you cannot outrun, asking not for penance, but for the simple act of setting one more place at a table that has always been big enough if only someone chose to pull an extra chair from the garage.